one person could get I think it's $35 fur bearer permit, and you could kill as many of those fur bearers as you want. It's unlimited. Setting a bag limit of 15 per day is also meaningless. It's set so high. I had one person do the math, and they said, well, you could get 20 hunters, and within 6 months they could wipe out what CPW believes the entire population, beaver population, is in Colorado, which is about 50,000.
Welcome, Wild Ones. I'm Josh Schlossberg, host of the Green Root Podcast, the official podcast of Eco Integrity Alliance, where we're on a quest to uncover the roots of the ecological crisis. This week, our guest is Jen Clanahan. Jen has spent more than 30 years in the public and nonprofit sectors, focusing on conservation issues. Her experience includes working for numerous nonprofit conservation organizations on issues ranging from wildlife habitat, energy, climate, and public lands. She's also worked for multiple members of Congress. Welcome to the Green Root Podcast, Jen.
Thanks so much. Happy to be here.
So I asked you here because just this week, there were 2 bills in the Colorado House Agriculture, Water, and Natural Resources Committee that were introduced dealing with wildfire, wildlife, wildlands, and I don't want to give any spoilers away, but we're going to talk about what happened there. And we're going to focus primarily on the bill that you were most engaged with, but we'll also talk a little bit about this other bill that I was engaged with, and then maybe some of the overlap. So what was the beaver bill all about?
So wildfire resilience and beaver bill was a bill that looked at some science that has come out recently. Dr. Emily Fairfax in particular has really made this connection between beaver inhabited riverscapes and wildfires. So she's done several studies around this topic, but one in particular really caught our attention because it was focused here in Colorado. So she looked at 3 mega fires, which included the Cameron Peak and the troublesome fires that we had here in 2020. And I think mega fire is defined as more than 100,000 acres. And so she studied these areas after the fires, and found that the intensity of the wildfire was much lower in areas with beaver activity. And in fact, some areas stayed green and did not burn at all. And so putting 2 and 2 together, Colorado's got a pretty serious drought this year. Wildfire will be a concern. And we thought, well, beavers can help us if we just let them, if we simply leave them alone and let them. And so this bill would have prohibited take or killing of beavers for recreational purposes only, or for commerce, just selling the beaver parts on public lands in order to help with our wildfire resilience here in Colorado.
That's a great summary. Thank you. Yeah. Keep going if you got more on that.
Okay. I was just going to sort of talk a little bit about the process of how we got to that proposal. We had started by looking at high and moderate risk areas in the state for wildfire. And so the Colorado State Department of Forestry did some mapping. And we looked at, where the high, where the moderate risk areas for wildfire. And originally, we were going to propose that recreational take be prohibited in just those areas. It quickly became pretty apparent that it was going to be difficult to enforce on the ground. It would be difficult for hunters to know where they were. And it would also be something that changed over time, and with the maps and enforcement lag. So in looking at those maps again, it became clear that there was actually a lot of overlap. When you're looking at the areas where this high and moderate risk is faced, it's on public lands. And so that's why, to simplify things, we just made the prohibition on public lands.
That makes a lot of sense. So I would argue that the bill, as it stands in terms of we should be protecting beavers just for the sake of not killing beavers. In my mind, that's enough. We shouldn't need another justification. But unfortunately, in this country, you have to come up with additional reasons not to kill wildlife. And I think a lot of people get the wrong idea about Colorado because it's a nature state. There's a lot of nature. I would say, and this is where it gets controversial, I would say there's more nature users than there are nature lovers. You don't have to agree with that statement. And so, yeah, there's a lot of people out there taking from nature, but sadly, those who want to give back as much or protect, we're out there, but, and we may outnumber the other folks, but the other folks are a lot more vocal. So just talking about the rights of the beaver to live. I assume you would agree with that, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think beaver have their own intrinsic value, and we could probably spend this entire time just talking about the benefits of beavers in general. I mean, there's so many benefits from, they're little eco engineers. They slow down the water and therefore allow the ground to absorb it. So you're recharging the groundwater, you're raising the water table. There's more, the vegetation can then absorb that water. That creates habitat for other species. I think that there's a statistic that says something about wetlands in the Intermountain West provide 80% of the habitat, even though it's only 2 to 3% of the actual land out there. So they're just so critical.
They are, and they were trapped almost out of existence across a lot of the West over the previous centuries for fur. And I guess they're still being trapped for fur. Why are people killing beavers still?
Um, I think there are still people who sell the fur. I think there are some people that claim to eat them. I don't know. I can't really confirm that.
Well, just for the record, any dinner party that I'm invited to and they're serving beaver, you don't have to invite me to that one. But okay, well, I mean, it's good to know, and it's good to know the history of that. And they are recovering in some numbers. But yeah, the argument is pretty much a no-brainer. The agencies across Colorado talk all the time about wildfire, and I'll probably get into a little more. I think they exaggerate the risks of wildfire, but nevertheless, if the goal is to reduce severity of burning in nature, it's very clear that retaining water on the landscape is the absolute key. It's been one of the hottest, driest, least snowpacky winters we've ever experienced. I live up at 8,500 feet and we barely had any snow. The snowpack is completely gone here. You can go to about 10,000 feet and there's still some snow. So this is some of the driest uh, season we've ever seen. And so it would seem an obvious thing. All the folks in the agencies who are saying wildfires is a concern, landscape resiliency, this is a way to do it. And so let's just give away the ending here. How did the House Natural Resources Agriculture Water Committee, how did they vote on this bill?
Unfortunately, they voted it down 10-3.
Okay.
And it was extremely disappointing. As you mentioned, we've got, major drought happening this year in Colorado. That's making the news every day. And we also are in a budget crisis. The state legislature right now is looking to cut, I believe it's $1.5 billion from the budget. They also had to cut close to $1 billion last year. And beavers will help us out for free if we just leave them alone and let them. You've got I think it's the Forest Service that's doing some studies up in northern Colorado. There's just a Denver Post article about it recently, where they're spending money to pretend that they're beavers. They're putting in beaver dam analogs and they're studying the benefits, and they're finding, oh, hey, look, there's benefits. And they're spending who knows how much money doing it. If we just leave the beavers alone, they'll do it for us for free. And by the way, the study up north, what they're doing is studying about the benefits that beaver dams provide after fire. So not only are they helpful before, and during, they provide refugia for other species so that they can survive, but afterwards as well. So what they're finding, picture a typical mountainside with a fire that's gone through, and now ash will get washed down into the streams that are in the valleys below, after the fire. What they're finding is that ash will then collect and then settle in beaver ponds, or these pretend beaver ponds, and then that improves the water quality after wildfire. So, their beaver dams are really helpful after fires as well.
Yeah, I mean, talking about human nature here or whatever it is that we humans do, it's like nature has these processes that have been working since time immemorial. And we're like, let's prevent those, but we'll try to mimic those human wise. And it's like, I know we need jobs, but that's a pretty ridiculous way to create jobs.
Yeah, and to spend a lot of money that we don't have.
I mean, I'm trying to think of other ridiculous circumstances like earthworms. Like, are we going to let's kill off the earthworms and then let's send a bunch of people in the forest to sort of like dig in the soil to do the job of earthworms? It's like, how about we trust nature a little bit? So I have a question, and I haven't heard this raised, and I want to talk a little bit more about the makeup of that committee. But let me first get this out of the way. So Colorado Parks and Wildlife, which manages public lands and wildlife in Colorado, or at least the state public lands, they put out I don't believe it was a report, some sort of management plan around beavers that coincided pretty closely with the existence of the bill. And I noticed over and over again, they kept saying, because most of the people, or a lot of the people who testified against the bill were, of course, in the agencies in Colorado, they said, we don't need this bill to prevent killing beavers because we got a management plan. So we got that taken care of. So two-part question for the president here. So the question number one, does their management plan cover the things that the bill would? And part two of that is, do you feel as if they created that management plan in order to stymie this bill, or is that just a conspiracy theory I have in my head?
Um, sure. Well, so just a quick correction. The
Okay.
agency folks were not opposed to the bill. We worked actually really hard to get CPW, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, to a neutral position. So we worked with them. We put an amendment in place that got them to the point where they were neutral. There were a couple former agency staffers. I think they were actually regional foresters, so they were U.S. Forest Service employees, former employees, that testified against it.
Okay, that's a
But
good clarification. I appreciate that. I want to be accurate with those things.
yeah, just because I point that out because a lot of legislators, when they're determining how they're going to vote, they look to the agency staff.
Got it.
So it was relevant in the debate. But yes, to your question about the strategy. So the Colorado Parks and Wildlife spent some time talking to stakeholders and developing the Beaver Conservation Management Strategy, I believe is the full title. And that came out recently. And so several folks said, well, CPW has a beaver plan, so we don't need something else. Here's the problem. And I call it a strategy rather than a plan because they specifically point out on page 11, I cited it many times, so I know the page, that it was a framework for coordination and resources, but it's not an implementation plan. So they don't have a step-by-step plan. Here's how we're going to boost beaver populations, which they say is the goal. So we said this bill is complementary because it is actually part of implementation. There's a lot in their strategy. There's some things that I think are great, but there's also not an actionable implementation plan. There's one part where they talk about take or hunting, killing of beavers. And what they say is that they will study localized populations over the next 2-3 years, and maybe at that point they will consider harvest limits. So a harvest limit is over the entire population, how many can be taken versus a bag limit, which is what one individual can take. The problem with that is that's a maybe someday, so it may or may not happen. And the other potential problem is that it may be set so high as to be meaningless and not actually restrict take. And we just saw an example of that come out of CPW. They set bag limits for what they call fur bearers, the fur bearer category, of which beavers are one. They proposed a bag limit of 15 per day. Now, right. So right now it's unlimited. So one person could get I think it's $35 fur bearer permit, and you could kill as many of those fur bearers as you want. It's unlimited. Setting a bag limit of 15 per day is also meaningless. It's set so high. I had one person do the math, and they said, well, you could get 20 hunters, and within 6 months they could wipe out what CPW believes the entire beaver population is in Colorado, which is about 50,000. So that didn't seem to us to be much of a guarantee that they were going to do anything about recreational hunting. And so this bill is complementary to the plan to actually do something, take action to boost beaver populations.
So do you think that their plan was meant, even if surreptitiously, to derail the bill, even if they didn't
Yes,
officially
question
oppose?
2. I don't think so. I don't think that was the intent. I do think that there are people at CPW who are genuinely interested in boosting beaver numbers across the state, that put a lot of work into the plan, to be fair. I just think that it's an agency that, well, they're an enterprise. And so the way they bring in their money, some of their money, I think it's 60%, is hunter and fisher licenses. And so they are incentivized to do that. And they are always reticent to reduce the numbers of licenses that they'll issue. And so I think that is just built into the system. And I think that that's part of why we're where we are today.
Sure. And yeah, I mean, that is a textbook conflict of interest. And I tend to focus on critiques of agencies, bureaucracies, sometimes elected officials, but never individuals such as agency staff, who I do believe, for the most part, are trying to do the right thing. I think they do sometimes get caught up in what their role is. I recently had on the podcast an individual named Lyle Lewis, who was former endangered species chief for Fish and Wildlife Department. He told me all about good folks in the agency who can't really do their jobs. And then I had another individual, Jeff Rook, from Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, who represents whistleblowers inside these agencies. So yes, there are good folks in these agencies. A lot of times they can't do their jobs. And yes, I will maintain that that is a conflict of interest. It's like when the U.S. Forest Service is there to supposedly both protect public lands, yet they get funding for the federal timber sale program, and much of their funding is increasingly just for logging, supposedly in the name of wildfire. That is a conflict of interest. Having a conflict of interest does not mean you are automatically corrupt. Although I will say another podcast I had recently actually it was also Jeff Rook talking about how members inside the Forest Service were caught colluding with the timber industry for timber theft. So in that case, there was corruption.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, the last thing I'll say about Colorado Parks and Wildlife is I had some engagement years ago on the podcast. I had actually discontinued the podcast and then kind of restarted it as a part of Eco Integrity Alliance. But at the time, I had interviewed a biologist for Colorado Parks and Wildlife around his research on chronic wasting disease, which is a prions, which are these, they're not even viruses, they're just these kind of, I don't want to say nasty, but they're nasty for humans and wildlife. They're an infectious entity, basically. Anyway, and that is rampant in populations of elk, moose, and deer, and it kills them. And it's not known to pass to humans, but it's possible that it could at some point. And anyway, it's out there. It's decimating the herds. And there was some science inside the department from this biologist finding that mountain lions can target and they end up killing more of the deer and elk that have chronic wasting disease, kind of taking them off of the landscape to infect others. And that was what his science was. And I asked him on the podcast, well, your agency is also killing predators like the mountain lion. How do you,
Exactly.
right? So
And
I
wolves
asked
too. Wolves at
wolves,
the, yep.
bears, I mean, coyote, like across the board. And then there's federal efforts to do that. So I asked him, what about that contradiction? And he sort of basically admitted, if I recall, that it was a contradiction, but his job is to provide the science. So that's what ends up happening in these agencies is the science comes out, then it's not taken into account. There's actually most Forest Service studies on the wildfire issue show that logging does not prevent wildfire. It doesn't prevent the severity. It doesn't reduce severity, doesn't prevent the spread to communities, and actually could increase it. That's in their own science, but it's never implemented. So, anything else to say about Colorado Parks and
Yeah,
Wildlife?
just along those same lines, that biologists within CPW will say that the science will say that you can take 20, maybe even 30% of the beaver population and still have it be a sustainable take, and that hunters are only taking 2 to 4% of the beaver population. But the problem is he's working with some information gaps, because that's not including all of the beavers that are killed on private land. So on private land, anybody that considers beavers a nuisance, water users or just somebody who maybe the beaver pond is going to flood their road, whatever reason, they can just go out and kill that beaver. You don't need a permit. You don't need to report it to the state, and that's actually CDA, Department of Ag. So nobody knows how many beavers are being killed as nuisance beavers, and so when you don't have those numbers, it's hard to say that what the hunters are taking is 2 to 4%. They don't actually know the number of beavers that are being taken in a given year. And furthermore, the hunter reporting is voluntary. So that tends to be underreported as well. So it's to say 2 to 4% is way under a sustainable amount is not necessarily the case. And if it were the case, then beaver populations should be growing, but they're not. The beaver population is about 50,000 now, and according to the beaver management strategy that they just put out, it was about 50,000 in 1941 when they did a study. So, there's science, and then there's properly using science and having all the information and having the science informed decisions. It's all a bit different.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, so we can leave aside the CPW stuff. I know people have different strategies in how to influence these entities. I know there's some good folks on them. I think it can also be argued that they need more pressure, but I think there are different ways to address things, and we all have our own strategies and tactics for doing so. But let me ask you, I don't say this is a technical question, but if people are trapping beavers on public lands, does that mean they just have these leg traps that are just left in the stream? What does that mean?
No, so 1996, maybe there was an initiative that was passed that restricted the kinds of traps that could be used here in Colorado. So there's not as many that can be used as in other states. It has to be live trap. Um, and so apparently from what I'm told by CPW is that more often beavers are shot than are trapped in Colorado these days.
Okay, so it's just people popping off shots at the water, basically. All right, well,
Mhm.
that's good to know, I guess. So let's talk a little bit about the Colorado House Agriculture, Water, and Natural Resources Committee. So when I was asking you for the title, because I had forgotten it off the top of my head, because to be honest, I've only recently started directly engaging with the State House here in Colorado, and I want to talk about that other bill in a minute. But so I was like, yeah, the Natural Resources Committee. You're like, yeah, the Colorado House Agriculture, Water, and Natural Resources Committee. The most important point being agriculture is in there. I mean, even the term natural resources, we could argue is human centric, but that could be neutral. Agriculture is not neutrals. And I know for a fact that I haven't looked into the backgrounds of all the folks, but one of them admitted, one of the members, he's a public lands rancher. And he was saying, well, what if I want to blow up a dam that will keep my cows from walking down this canyon? And it's like, in my mind, I'm like, cool, this is the reason why we shouldn't actually have public lands ranching at all, because now you're moving it over to this other, you're saying, well, we have similar this multiple use concept, which is, well, we can have protection of wildlife and we can have cows on the land, except when that conflicts with mine and then mine has to win. So what do you think about the makeup of the committee and just its mission tying agriculture into this?
Yeah, that's an ongoing, I would say, problem for wildlife, because whenever there is a conflict, it's the people and the agriculture and the business that are always going to win, and the wildlife are always going to lose. And so there's just sort of that inherent conflict in the, I would say, in having bills be considered that way.
Sure. And I don't know if you have the names off to your top of your head, and that's fine if you don't, but I think it's important to praise those who are doing the right thing. So do you have the names of the representatives who voted in favor of protecting beavers and public lands?
Yes. Representative Lindsay, she was the prime sponsor of the legislation. And so a huge thank you to her for all of her work on this legislation, supporting it, carrying it through the process, everything that she did. So huge thank you to Representative Lindsay. And then Representatives Martinez and Story voted yes. They were the other two yes votes on the committee for the bill. Also, a huge thank you to both of them. Representative Story is also a fantastic champion on wildlife issues, and I believe the sponsor of the other bill that you want to chat about. So, yeah, big thanks to them.
That's absolutely true. So that's good to know. Do you know of any other potential conflicts of interest with the folks on the committee who voted against it? And I'll just preface it by saying Rep. Smith is my representative, and we've made multiple attempts just to even talk to her about the science of wildfire in public lands. She won't even respond to the emails. So thus far, we have to acknowledge that. I mean, it's not that she's just wrong on the issues. She won't even engage with her constituents, which I think disqualifies her, frankly, from political office. That's my personal opinion, Josh Schlossberg. Anyway,
Yeah, we were able to chat with her briefly in the Capitol, and but I agree that these representatives are voted in and work for their constituents and should be meeting with them.
yes. Well, so do you have anything else on the Beaver bill? Because I want to talk about the other bill and I'll frame it with the overlap. But
Um, I think that it's it's disappointing, and it's just sort of big picture. It's what's wrong with politics in Colorado is, excuse me, something that seems like a no-brainer. I mean, the number of beavers we're talking about, CPW estimates are maybe 400 beaver that are being killed by recreational hunters on public lands. So it's not a lot, but it would have made a difference. And we're talking about recreational hunters. So this is primarily folks who it's a hobby for them. And maybe they make a little bit of money off of selling a pelt. Nobody's making a living as a trapper these days. So when you look at the fact that we're in such a serious drought and a budget crisis, the fact that to have just left some beaver there that could help us so dramatically that they couldn't even do that,
Right.
it's just so disappointing.
Well,
It's mind-boggling, really.
one thing that I've come to understand about strategy, political strategy, so I've been an environmental organizer, kind of on and off, but for about 20 something years, is the other side says no to any potential change of the status quo, or frankly, any prevention of an increase in their commandeering of public lands and wildlife. So they understand that strategy like it's the NRA strategy, which is, oh, is that a reasonable change and reform? No, every time. You will know where we stand, and it is no every time. The elected officials like, well, if we're gonna have their support, we can't ever budge. So that has been very successful. So I think they stick to that all the time. And I'm not, critiquing anyone in this. I think our side doesn't necessarily play by the same playbook because we're reasonable, rational human beings for the most part. And we are like, well, let's just try to find a middle ground. They're like, oh, thanks for admitting the middle ground. We're not moving at all. So that's what has reflected upon my advocacy over the years. People consider me and Eco Integrity Alliance that are guiding principles to be unreasonable because we say we oppose all extraction on public lands, and hunting and trapping is extraction. Now, if we were the elected officials or like king of the world and what we said happened, maybe we'd have to consider, well, maybe, that, but we're not. We're advocates. All we have is our position. So we push from a particular position in hopes it will move in our direction. And the one thing I think we can not worry about is environmentalists having too much clout right now, right? That's not a real thing. So the other side will always say no. Our side will want to make compromises, and I think we have to look in the long term about whether that's effective. But personally, I think this beaver bill makes a ton of sense. It tries to frame things in a multiple perspectives as to the benefit of these creatures, but we have to accept that our opposition does not care about any of those arguments. They do not care about the science for the most part, my personal opinion. They don't care about public opinion, and they'll keep saying we have to do it based on the science. That is just people in power using words that are not accurate. It's like, this is the science. And they're like, well, it's not the science we like. And it's like, well, then don't frame it as that. But they're in charge. And what I've seen is that elected officials are not experts, and they're not meant to be. So who do they go to? They go to their agency staff and people in that world who have, their funding is directly tied to management and extraction. And so when we then say to the elected officials, listen, you should of course take into account what your staff is saying, but you can't only take that into account. And if we point out contradictions in what they're saying, then you have to rethink that. You can't just go lockstep with what you're told. And at that point, I stopped getting emails back from them. But that's kind of so that is what Eco Integrity Alliance does. But we work with people who have a variety of perspectives on this. Anyone who has 10% overlap, that's what we will help, and we'll help raise their voice or pretend that we have no affiliations with them. If they don't want to publicly affiliate with us, that's fine too. But on the Green Root podcast, we want to hear people's perspective. And so I very much support this bill. I thought it was a great thing to do. And yes, Rep. Story and Lindsay and Martinez, who voted in favor, they deserve to be commended for, I would just say having basic common sense, but in this day and age, that's brave.
Yeah. Sadly, you're right.
So that's my little pitch on that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this other bill, HB 1310, and the overlap. So both of these bills were introduced in the same day, and both of them were about wildfire is a concern. How do we address it? So the Beaver bill, we're like, well, here's how we can address this on the landscape that isn't logging. And the this home hardening bill basically would have done only this, taken a tiny percentage of the tens of millions of dollars in state funding that is going towards logging in the state in the name of wildfire, which, according to consensus science, is not effective at reducing high severity wildfire and does not prevent the spread of fire to homes. In fact, can heat up, dry out the forest, open it to wind, which can spread flame. That isn't even the Forest Service studies. They don't conclude that. But if you look in their evidence and then you look at all the independent science, that is consensus science. There is some science that shows that maybe some minimal thinning in some forests sometimes can reduce some of the lower severity fires, which are already easily contained and not, according to them, even an impact on the forest. So there's that kernel of truth, but then they're like, oh, it's going to protect communities and reduce high severity wildfire. No, it's not. And to make things more complicated, uh, the only critique I would maybe have of some of the people testifying about the beaver thing is that high severity fire is both historic and natural to forest ecosystems and essential. But I would, of course, argue that retaining landscape, moisture on the landscape, particularly in these riparian areas, that's of course a no-brainer to do. So that's all fine. But the irony is this. So our government is saying wildfire is a concern. Home hardening is 100% consensus science says is the most effective thing you can do. It's the materials on the home. It's just there's just no actual debate. But the funding is almost non-existent for that. And so people who can afford it do it. But this bill would have routed a tiny percentage towards low-income folks, seniors, and people with disabilities. So a tiny drop in the bucket towards protecting the homes and communities, the things we know that's the most effective. So many people in our government, our elected officials, our agencies, and even a few NGOs, such as, and I'm going to name them here because we've tried to talk to them and they won't engage on this. The Nature Conservancy, Conservation Colorado, and Western Resource Advocates. They actually came on the stand and said, please do not take a dollar away from logging to protect people's homes. That is what they said in essence. And I'm going to be putting out more detailed information on that, but that is a fact. So I don't want to belabor the point here, but I do want to say that here in Colorado, we have a real disconnect, and maybe I'll get into this, and I want to get your feedback on that. A real disconnect between what is actually environmentally sound and what is the pretense of being such. But before going into that, to finish my little mini rant here, both of these bills would have done the thing that the people who are talking about wildfire all the time say they actually want to do, but it shows that they don't want to do that. And I think it also shows that there are some folks who are willing to put their necks out. So I will, in this case, say Representative Tammy Story. Now, Eco Integrity Alliance doesn't endorse political candidates, and we have some small engagement with some legislation, but that's a very small percentage of what we do. But Rep. Story was the one who decided to put forth this bill, this very common sense, obvious bill, because she had been seeing all of this aggressive logging in her area. And in fact, the entity that is doing the most logging in her district is Jefferson County and Jefferson County Open Space. And Commissioner Leslie Dahlkemper, who is a big advocate of logging, she came on to testify against protecting the homes of low income, elderly, and disabled people in Colorado because she wants all the funding to flow into the agencies to do more logging. And of course, the agencies are going to want more money to do logging because that's what pays their salaries. But anyway, I think I covered that. There were other government folks, all of whom get taxpayer money to do more logging. I mean, it was pretty much just across the board. The people who did speak in favor of the bill were firefighters. Actually, many firefighters were like, hey, we have to protect homes. And there were people who live adjacent to national forests, like myself and others, and an HOA president, et cetera. But Representative Tammy Story had walked those lands that were being logged in Jefferson County, and she was appalled by them, as were most people who saw this. And clear cutting, it's not taking the smallest trees, clear cutting is cutting some of the largest trees. So she decided to act upon this over time. And this bill was a really common sense way of doing it. It's not even saying don't do logging. It's just like, can we do some of the funding, which is going right now about 100 to 1 towards logging? Can we put a tiny bit of that? So she put herself out there. She made this bill happen. She introduced it in hopes that it would pass through the Natural Resources Committee and the rest of the legislators could vote on it. And so maybe the public could even know about it, because media doesn't refuses to cover this stuff. They've sort of sided a lot with the extraction development perspective. But she voted in favor of it, of course, her bill. Representative Lindsay, Representative Martinez, and Representative Velasco. So thank you to all of them for, again, a pretty common sense, obvious thing in this day and age is rare. And yeah, unfortunately, the other folks, including my representative, Representative Smith, voted against protecting communities from wildfire. I just don't know what else to say about that. But let me, and you can comment on that if you like. But what I wanted to steer it towards is that connection between the bills here. So we're up against, as I see it, the extraction community, sometimes the industrial recreation community, which has some impacts. I support a lot of recreation in hope, because I'm a recreator, but in hopes that they will speak out more for public lands protection. It hasn't happened as much. And there are folks who are also not necessarily well versed in the science, who are members of the general public, who have gotten really frightened by this. But I would say a lot of it is also the developers. And those are the folks who, in my opinion, are pushing a lot of what one can say is pro-extraction, anti-environment. You don't have to agree with that, but I want to hear from you now that I've talked endlessly for the last 15 minutes. What do you think are the forces that we're up against in this blue state of nature lovers in Colorado?
Yeah, it's so frustrating. You would think that folks that move here because they love the outdoors, people who appreciate being in the outdoors, you would hope that they would take the time to educate themselves about the issues and speak up to preserve it so that, we can take our kids out to do the things that we enjoy in nature, and our grandkids someday take them on a hike and they have a chance to see deer while we're hiking, or beaver, or whatever. And well, there's, I think, a couple problems. And yeah, so much of these issues comes down to money. I mean, we're competing against folks who are the developers, or the extractive industry, and they have money and they use it. And unfortunately, nonprofits are just that, and we don't have a lot of money to throw around and pay for contributions to campaigns to the extent that they do, and advertising. You see ads on the TV in the evenings when you're watching, and just money can buy a lot of things that nonprofits can't, despite the fact that I would say that the public is generally with us on these issues. I mean, the public wants to know that wildlife are going to survive and even thrive. They want to know that forests are going to be protected. They want to know that when they next go hiking or whatever their activity is, that the resources are going to be there for them to do that. And the problem is they don't have the time to get into the details. That everybody's busy and they don't. They come home from a day of work and they don't necessarily sit down and analyze what's happening and following all of the decisions that are being made at whatever level. And so, yeah, we're at a disadvantage in that way. I think it's cost us a lot.
Yeah, and I agree that the public that is aware of these issues want to support things, but unfortunately, they're being, in my opinion, not just misinformed, they're being disinformed by a lot of folks who want to say use wildfire to exploit as a form of extraction. And I think it really comes down to those who believe that nature needs to be managed. And one can argue that there's a sliding scale there. There's a spectrum of course, but there are ones who believe in this heavy-handed management. There are actually people in the state of Colorado, many of them, who believe that forests could not exist without humans, which just doesn't even make any sense. Obviously, we can alter them. We can find some overlap between what nature wants to do and what we want the forest to do. Okay. But the idea that, I mean, sorry, forests did exist before any humans were in the world. So I tend to trust that, but that I think is the biggest conflict. I agree that the money is of course central to it all, from industry, the government's funding itself. Most funding for a lot of these agencies right now is just wildfire. So they're like, I guess we're a wildfire logging entity now, since that's where the funding is, since it's drying up elsewhere, which is why I think they fought so hard to prevent any funding from going away from logging, and why they do benefit from people killing wildlife because there's funding in that, et cetera. But yeah, so I think that is the ideology is also a major thing because I like to people are like, all right, what is that elected official? What kickbacks is that elected official getting? And I'm like, I think that happens, but I think that's a bit of an exaggeration. I think it's that they have a certain ideology that they share with the management folks, the developers and the management folks. So yeah, they're getting money. Maybe that's corrupting them. I'm sure that happens in some cases, but I think it's more like they already think that way. And so the entities that support management, extraction, development are going to be like, this person thinks the way we do. So what would you say
You're
about that?
exposed to it so much, with the glossy brochures and the ads on TV, and the folks with the money can just generate so much more material or opportunities or whatever that makes it look like more people share their belief than actually do.
Totally agree. Yeah, so trying to wind things down here. This has been great to have you because you have knowledge on some of these topics that I don't have, as pretty much all my guests do, but particularly on this and the beaver issue. But so we're not just here to complain and bemoan the fact that we weren't able to make things happen this time. We're not giving up.
That's right.
But so one thing that I noticed that could be done better, and this is something some of us are actively working on, is to try to find more overlap between those who have a focus on wildlife, like wolves, predators, creatures like that, beavers, which, of course, and those who maybe focus more just on the public land itself, ecosystems, landscapes, which tends to be me. I try to find overlap, but that's more my wheelhouse. So, do you think that there we all could do a better job overlapping? And if so, how could we do so? Big question.
Absolutely. I come at it from both sides. I'm a conservationist of the environment and public lands and also of wildlife. And for me, it's really, we need healthy populations of our native species fulfilling their ecological roles in order to have healthy ecosystems. That's baseline. And I agree that we could partner together more. I think that folks should. I think we can. I think there's so much that we can do. We're stronger together than we are divided, obviously.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I would say that a specific example of where, say, the public lands ecosystem folks, such as myself, haven't done as good a job is, yeah, things like beaver, incorporating their benefits on the landscape when we're just talking about the landscape. So obviously, the landscapes are formed by the wildlife and vice versa. So you can't really separate the two, but some of us have our I'll even admit my blinders on. I'm just like the land. I obviously care about wildlife, but that ends up being less of what I pay attention to. I need to do a better job of all of those incorporations. Another example beyond the beavers is wolves and those studies in Yellowstone where there weren't wolves there. And so I believe it was the elk were eating too much of the riparian vegetation because they got lazy. And so they brought some wolves around and got them back into shape. And then the riparian corridors recovered.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah,
landscape. Yeah.
they move them along so they don't overbrowse. And they were, overbrowsing, and the cottonwoods were not surviving that. And so you bring the wolves in, it moves the elk along, those cottonwoods then recover. Then of course you've got better songbird habitat. I mean, it's all connected. And
Yeah.
to be fair, I know everybody's busy and there's only so many hours in a day, but yeah, I definitely think that there's so many ways that we can partner and make each other stronger.
Absolutely, totally necessary. And yeah, I guess the only feedback I would give to the wildlife community is just be careful about demonizing wildfire on the landscape because it is a really essential component. And obviously, there can be concerns with it. But the truth of the matter is the only thing we can really do about protecting communities is to protect the communities, and that's right around the homes. And if can be a reduction in wildfire severity, I mean, the question is whether that's really necessary. There may come a time where we are having more severe wildfires than we have in the past. The truth of the matter is, historically speaking, we're not. We're just back into a current level where, for sure, more than over the last several decades. And I think that can be probably attributed, at least in part, to climate change. But I do think the idea of, well, let's retain water on the landscape as a way to deal with wildfire. No question. That to me is sound messaging. I think just caution about terminology around like catastrophic fires, et cetera. The forest needs fire. It needs it. But yes, historically, it probably is not going to be burning in those areas that are more riparian. And in fact, I have an example that is quarter of a mile from where I am, and I walk out there every day. I call it the Druids Grove. So it's this patch of old growth spruce forest primarily and some fir that is Douglas fir that is at this high elevation, 8,500 feet, which is pretty rare because this one area didn't burn because it is by a natural spring. And the areas that do burn, they're supposed to burn. That's fine. I don't mourn them. That's what it's supposed to do. But this area was not supposed to burn because it was moist and it hasn't. And they actually wanted to build a road through it, and we got them to stop it. So that's
Right.
a positive thing. But that's an example of moisture on the landscape. In this case, I don't think there are any beavers because these are springs. I don't believe there's any beaver activity here, but it is a moist area, and that has prevented a high severity fire from burning through here. So that is a fact. But so the last thing I want to ask you, you've been very generous with your time, is the culminating question that is the essence of the Green Root podcast, which is getting to the root causes of the eco crisis. Now, we have to do bills in the Colorado State Legislature, no question. Those are all important, crucial components of it. But looking as deep as we can, what would be, in your opinion, a root cause, doesn't have to be the root cause, of the eco crisis, or at least a component of the eco crisis?
Yeah, it's a great question. Um, a lot of it, I think, is we seem to be on this trajectory where everybody has to work harder just to get by. Uh, you know, a generation or two ago, you could have one person in the household working and they'd have bring in enough income that the family could have they could achieve the American dream, right? And now you have to have both parents, if they have kids, working, two individuals working to try and pay a mortgage if you want to own a home. And that is getting even harder and harder for people to achieve. You, dealing with corporations has got, like say your phone bill is incorrect. You can't just call somebody and you get somebody on the phone immediately and they apologize and they fix it. It's going to take 3 phone calls after you wait for 20 minutes on hold to get a person who might fix it. It seems like it's taking more and more from people just to get by, just to try and get close to the American dream or whatever their goals are. And I think that people have less and less time. And that means that they are less able to research these things we were talking about. What are the decisions being made that impact my environment? They don't have the capacity to go down to a state hearing potentially. I'm lucky that I do have that capacity, but a lot of people don't. They don't have the time to follow all these decisions and speak up and get to know the legislators. And I think that that's just been a trend. People, when they get home from work, they're going to have to figure out how to feed the kids, and then they clean up from dinner and they're exhausted. I know I am at the end of the day. So I think that this trend that we've seen in our country where the wealth is being centered with fewer and fewer people, and the masses are struggling to get by, I think that that's a problem.
Makes total sense to me. Thank you for that. Thank you for coming on the Green Root podcast. And of course, thanks for all of your great work.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for your work and thanks for the opportunity. This was fun.
Of course.